Welcome to the quietest corner of the village. We knew you'd find us eventually.
Chapter 1. Vanity and vexation. Agatha Raisin glared at the bathroom mirror with the intensity of a general surveying a lost battlefield. Dreadful, she muttered, tugging at a stray lock of hair that refused to obey the laws of physics or expensive hairspray. Absolutely ghastly. I looked like a moth-eaten Shropshire sheep. She had spent 45 minutes attempting a relaxed country chic look for the Carsely spring equinox luncheon, only to end up looking, in her own estimation, like a woman who had tried too hard and failed. Her roots were showing just a fraction, but to Agatha, they screamed of suburban neglactan. The new silk scarf, shed bought in Cheltenham, felt more like a noose than a fashion statement. The source of her foul mood, however, wasn't just the hair. It was the guest list. James Lacey, her neighbour and the object of her frequently thwarted affections, was attending. Worse still, he was escorting a newcomer to the village, a woman named Sybil Vane who, according to village gossip, was terribly clever and famously lithe. Agatha hated lithe people. She herself was more solidly built, a fact she tried to disguise with well-tailored suits and a punishingly expensive corset that currently made breathing a secondary priority to social standing. Right, she said to her reflection, slapping on a final, defiant layer of sunset crimson lipstick. If they want a village luncheon, I'll give them a village luncheon. I shall be the soul of charm. I shall be witty. I shall not, under any circumstances, mention Sybil Vane's neck being too long for her head. She grabbed her handbag, stomped out of her cottage, and marched toward the parish hall. Carsely was looking offensively picturesque. Daffodils were out, the Cotswold stone was glowing in the weak spring sunshine, and the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Normally, Agatha enjoyed the quiet beauty she had retired to after her high-flying PR career in London. Today, it just felt like a backdrop for her impending social humiliation. As she reached the hall, she saw the vicar, Mr. Alf Bloxby, standing by the door. Usually the vicar was a pillar of serene, if slightly weary, kindness. Today, however, he looked as though he had seen a ghost. His face was a pasty shade of grey, and his hands were trembling so violently that the programmes he was holding fluttered like dying birds. "Morning, Vicar," Agatha barked, her London instincts overriding the local pace. "You look peachy. Is it the flu? There's a nasty bug going around the primary school." "Mr." Bloxby jumped, nearly dropping the entire stack. "Oh, Agatha, no, not the floor, just the weight of the office. And the heat. Is it hot in here to you?" "It's 12 degrees Celsius, Alf. It's freezing," Agatha said, narrowing her eyes. She was a woman who made a living reading people, and the vicar was currently reading like a man who had just hidden a body in the vestry. Quite, he murmured, wiping sweat from his brow with a frayed handkerchief. I must see to the seating. Mrs. Bloxby is looking for you, Agatha. She's in the kitchen with the quiches." Agatha watched him scuttle away. Odd, she mused. Very odd. The hall was already buzzing with the usual suspects. Mrs. Margaret Witherspoon was currently holding court near the punch bowl, her voice carrying over the crowd like a foghorn. "Of course, the Historical Society is quite firm on the matter," Mrs. Witherspoon was saying. "The guest speaker, Julian Flight, assures me he has evidence that the village well was actually a site of pagan ritual. Shocking, isn't it? But Julian is so thorough." Agatha pushed past, looking for a gin and tonic, and finding only a tepid glass of elderflower cordial. She spotted James Lacey in the corner. He looked annoyingly handsome in a tweed jacket, leaning in to listen to the lithe Sybil Vane. Sybil was wearing a flowing linen dress that suggested she spent her mornings doing yoga and her afternoons being ethereal. Agatha felt a surge of pure, unadulterated jealousy. She marched over. "James," she cried, her voice perhaps a pitch too high. "Lovely day for a luncheon. Though I hear the quiche is likely to be soggy. Mrs. Pastry is always a gamble, isn't it?" James looked up, a faint, polite smile touching his lips. "Hello, Agatha. You remember Sybil?" Vividly, Agatha lied, having only seen her from a distance through binoculars. "The linen is brave for March, dear. Aren't you freezing?" Sybil smiled, a slow, serene expression. "I find the cold invigorating, Mrs. Raisin. It keeps the mind sharp." "Does it?" "I find it just gives one a runny nose," Agatha snapped. Before she could dig a deeper social hole, a loud crash echoed from the back of the hall. The heavy oak door to the vicar's private stud use today, as a green room for the guest speaker, had swung open. Mr. Bloxby stood in the doorway, his face now completely white. He looked at the crowd, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "Vicar?" Mrs. Bloxby called out, hurrying from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Alf, what is it? The vicar pointed a shaking finger back into the room. The speaker, he whispered. He's quite unable to give his lecture. Agatha, never one to wait for an invitation, shoved her way through the gathering crowd. She pushed past the vicar and peered into the small, wood-panelled room. Julian Flight, the flamboyant historian who was supposed to be the highlight of the afternoon, was slumped over the vicar's desk. A heavy bronze paperweight, usually used to hold down parish newsletters, lay on the floor. There was a very neat, very red hole in the back of Julian Flight's head. He's not unable to give the lecture, Alf, Agatha said, her voice cutting through the sudden, horrified silence of the room. He's dead. And unless he had a very peculiar accident with a paperweight, someone has murdered him right under our noses. Agatha felt a familiar, illicit thrill run through her. Her hair no longer mattered. Her roots didn't matter. Even Sybil Vane's linen dress didn't matter. There was a murder in Carsely, and Agatha Raisin was already calculating exactly how she was going to solve it. Chapter 2. Blue lights and Buffet Blues, the parish hall, which had been buzzing with the polite, low-level drone of village gossip, suddenly erupted into a cacophony of gasps and high-pitched queries. Mrs. Witherspoon looked as though she might faint, though she had the presence of mind to ensure she was leaning toward a sturdy chair before doing so. Agatha, however, was in her element. The adrenaline of a fresh scandal had completely smoothed over the irritation of her frizzy hair. She stood in the doorway of the study, arms crossed, looking for all the world like a nightclub bouncer in a sensible wool suit. "Nobody move," she commanded, her voice ringing with the authority of 20 years in London PR. "This is a crime scene. Don't touch the punch, don't touch the quiche, and for heaven's sake stay away from the vicar's sherry." "Agatha, really," James Lacey said, stepping forward, his brow furrowed in that way Agatha usually found ruggedly handsome but currently found patronizing. "We should call the police and let them handle the crowd." "You aren't a constable. I am a concerned citizen with a functioning brain, James," Agatha snapped. "Which is more than I can say for some of the people currently trampling over potential footprints in the hallway." The police arrived 20 minutes later in the form of Detective Inspector Wilkes, a man whose mustache seemed to have a life of its own, and whose opinion of Agatha Raisin was roughly equivalent to his opinion of a recurring toothache. "Mrs. Raisin." Wilkes sighed, stepping into the study and looking at the slumped form of Julian Flight. "I might have known. Did you do this, or did you just happen to be standing over the body when the clock struck 12? "Don't be ridiculous, Bill," Agatha said, ignoring his title as she always did when she wanted to annoy him. "I was in the main hall making sparkling conversation and wishing the elderflower cordial had a kick. The vicar found him." Wilkes turned his gaze to Mr. Bloxby, who was sitting on a folding chair in the corner, his head in his hands. Mrs. Bloxby was patting his shoulder with a rhythmic, clinical precision. "Vicar? You found the deceased?" I went in to check if he needed a glass of water before his talk," Bloxby stammered, his voice thin. The door was closed. "I knocked. There was no answer. When I opened it, there he was. Poor Julian. He was such a vibrant man." Agatha's eyes narrowed. She noticed that the vicar wasn't looking at the body, he was looking at the desk specifically, at a small empty space near the blotter. "Vicar," Agatha began, "was there anything on that desk when you entered? A notebook? A folder?" "Mrs. Raisin," Wilkes barked. "Ask the questions. Outside. All of you. Now." Agatha allowed herself to be herded out, but not before she caught a glimpse of Julian Flight's hands. They were clenched, as if head died trying to hold onto something. In the main hall, the luncheon had been officially abandoned. The lithe Sybil Vane was currently draped over a chair, sipping water and looking tragically beautiful. James was hovering nearby, looking concerned. Agatha felt a sharp pang of resentment. A man had been murdered, and James was playing knight-errant to a woman who probably didn't even know how to use a microwave. "Terrible business," a voice whispered in Agatha's ear. It was Mrs., the village's premier gossip and occasional source of Agatha's most reliable intelligence. "Quite," Agatha said, her eyes still on James. "Did you see anyone go into that study, Mrs. Mason? Usually have an eye for who's moving where." Mrs. Mason preened at the compliment. "Well, Julian Flight arrived early. Very puffed up he was. Said he had a bombshell for the village. He went straight into the study to prepare. I saw the vicar go in about 10 minutes later, looking very troubled. Then the vicar came out, and after that..." She leaned in closer, smelling faintly of mothballs and peppermint. I saw Sybil Vane heading that way. Agatha's heart gave a little leap. Sybil? Were you sure? Oh, yes. She said she was looking for the powder room, but she went down the corridor toward the study. She was gone for a good 5 minutes. Agatha glanced over at Sybil, who was currently dabbling a silk handkerchief at her eyes. Interesting, Agatha murmured. Very interesting. She decided a direct approach was needed. Agatha Raisin did not do subtle well, and she certainly didn't do it when James Lacey was involved. She marched over to the pair. Distressing, isn't it, Sybil? Agatha said, her voice dripping with a fake sympathy that wouldn't have fooled a toddler. To be so close to such a violent act. Mrs. mentioned she saw you heading toward the study earlier. Did you happen to see Julian before he stopped breathing? James looked up, his expression hardening. Agatha, leave her alone. She's had a shock. We've all had a shock, James. I am merely trying to establish a timeline. It's a PR technocracy's management. Sybil looked up, her eyes clear and remarkably unshocked. I did go down that corridor, Mrs. Raisin, but the door was locked. I assumed Mr. Flight wanted privacy, so I turned back. I never spoke to him. Locked? Agatha pounced. The vicar said he just walked in. Perhaps he has a key, Sybil said smoothly. He is the vicar, after all. It is his study. Agatha felt a prickle of unease. Why would the door be locked for Sybil and not for the vicar? And why did the vicar look like he was waiting for the floor to swallow him whole? As the police began taking formal statements, Agatha slipped away toward the kitchen. She needed a drink, but more than that, she needed to think. Julian Flight had promised a bombshell. In a village like Carsely, bombshells usually involved who was sleeping with whom, or who had embezzled the roof fund. She found the back door of the hall open. Standing just outside in the shadows of the stone porch was the vicar. He was holding a small, crumpled piece of paper, staring at it with an expression of pure agony. Vicar? Agatha said softly. Mr. Bloxby jumped, nearly falling off the step. He quickly shoved the paper into his pocket. Agatha, you startled me. What's on the paper, Alf? Is it from Julian? The vicar straightened his shoulders, trying to regain his dignity, but his eyes were haunted. It's nothing, Agatha. Just a parish matter. Please leave it be. There has been enough tragedy for one day. He hurried past her, back into the hall. Agatha watched him go, her mind racing. The vicar was lying. The clever Sybil was lying. And Julian Flight was dead. Right, Agatha whispered to herself, smoothing her skirt. If nobody is going to tell the truth, he'll just have to beat it out of them. Socially speaking, of course. She marched back into the room, ignoring the police tape and the glares from Wilkes. She had a murderer to find, and if she happened to ruin Sybil Vane's reputation in the process, well, that was just a professional bonus. Chapter 3, Research and Resentment. By the time the police had finished their initial sweep, and the last of the sombre villagers had drifted away from the parish hall, Agatha was back in Lilac Cottage, pacing her living room like a caged panther. She had poured herself a gin and tonic chevy on the gin. Light on the tonic and was currently nursing a grudge that was far larger than the murder itself. Agatha, leave her alone, she mimicked in a deep, mocking tone, directed at a framed photograph of James Lacey that she had conveniently forgotten to put away. Honestly, the man is a fool. A pretty face, a bit of linen, and a voice like honey, and he loses every shred of common sense. Sybil Vane was lying through her perfectly whitened teeth. The problem was, Agatha knew she was being unreasonable, which only made her more irritable. She was also deeply intrigued. Julian Flight had been a man of immense ego, much like herself, though she'd never admit Itan men like that didn't just get murdered for their bronze paperweights. They got murdered because they knew something that made someone else feel small, or poor, or guilty. She set her glass down with a firm thud. Right. If the police are going to spend their time taking statements from every doting grandmother in the parish, I shall have to do the heavy lifting. She knew Julian Flight had been staying at the old granary, a posh holiday rental on the outskirts of the village. Had been there for 3 weeks, purportedly finishing his book on Cotswold secrets. Agatha grabbed her coat and her car keys. As she pulled out of her driveway in her silver BMW, she spotted James and Sybil walking toward James Cottage. Sybil was leaning quite unnecessarily close to him, her hand resting lightly on his tweed arm. Agatha resisted the urge to honk the horn and instead accelerated, leaving a small cloud of exhaust in her wake. The old granary was a converted stone building that looked far too expensive for a wandering historian. Agatha parked a discreet distance away and approached on foot, her sensible heels clicking on the paved lane. To her disappointment, a yellow crime scene tape was already stretched across the front door. A lone police constable sat in a marked car nearby, looking bored and eating a sandwich. Agatha didn't do clandestine very well. She preferred the frontal assault. She marched up to the car and tapped on the window. Ah, the constable. A young man named Wong, whom Agatha had met during the unfortunate quiche incident of the previous year, rolled down the window. "Evening, missus," he said, sighing. "If you're looking for Di Wilkes, he's back at the station." "I'm not looking for Bill, Peter," Agatha said, leaning on the door. "I'm looking for Julian's research. He was supposed to lend me a book on local flora. Dreadfully important for my garden. The place is sealed, missus. Yesin. Orders. Ordon be abord. I'm not asking to go inside. But Julian mentioned had left a folder for me in the garden shed. He said it was explosive stuff, strictly botanical, of course." Constable Wong looked sceptical. "He told me it was all historical stuff about the village well." "Precisely," Agatha chirped. "The well is surrounded by aconitum monkshood. Highly poisonous. That's what I wanted to check. Now be a dear and look the other way while I check the shed. It's not even in the house." Wong looked at his sandwich, then at the determined glint in Agatha's eyes. He knew from experience that it was easier to let Agatha Raisin have her way than to argue. 5 minutes, and I didn't see you. Agatha hurried toward the back of the property. The shed was a neat, timber-framed building. Inside, it smelled of lawnmower petrol and damp earth. On a small workbench sat a leather briefcase, partially open. Agatha's heart hammered against her ribs. She flipped the latch. Inside were maps of Carsely, photocopies of old parish records, and a thick, spirally bound notebook. She leafed through it quickly. Her eyes caught a name. Bloxby. She squinted at the handwriting. Julian had been tracing the lineage of the local clergy. There were notes about a missing decade in the late 70s. Then, a sentence underlined twice in red ink. "The pagan well isn't to the scandal, it's the land deed of 1978. The church doesn't own the North Acre. He does, sir," Agatha whispered. She heard a footstep outside the shed. She quickly shoved the notebook under her coat, just as the door creaked open. It wasn't Constable Wong. It was Sybil Vane. The lithe newcomer stood in the doorway, her silhouette sharp against the fading evening light. Gone was the serene, fragile victim from the parish hall. Her expression was hard, her eyes narrowed with a cold, calculating intelligence. "Mrs. Raisin," Sybil said, her voice like ice. "I thought you were at home nursing your disappointment." Agatha stood up straight, her coat bulging awkwardly with the stolen notebook. "And I thought you were busy being comforted by James. What are you doing here, Sybil?" "This is a crime scene. I could ask you the same. But I think we both know Julian was a man who kept many secrets. Secrets that don't belong in the hands of a retired PR woman with a hobby for meddling. Meddling? Ill of you know I've solved more crimes in this village than the entire Gloucestershire constabulary." Agatha blustered, though she felt a rare prickle of genuine fear. There was something dangerous about the way Sybil stood. "Then you should know when to stop," Sybil said. She stepped into the shed, closing the distance. Julian was a fool. He thought he could use his bombshell to climb the social ladder. He didn't realize that some people would rather see the ladder burn down. "Are you threatening me?" Agatha demanded, her bravado returning. "Because I have a black belt in, well, I took a self-defense class in London once, and I am not afraid to use my handbag." "Ah," Sybil let out a short, sharp laugh. "Go home, Agatha, before you find out that the vicar's secret isn't the only thing buried in this village." Without another word, Sybil turned and vanished into the twilight. Agatha waited until she heard the sound of a car engine starting nearby before she practically bolted from the shed. She gave a hurried wave to Constable Wong and sped away, her mind spinning faster than her wheels. "The landed of Yi Chochin Jabai Chi Shopach. Yopechi, the North Acre, and the vicar's missing decade." Julian Flight hadn't been killed over ancient history. Had been killed because he had discovered that the very ground the church stood on, perhaps the vicarage itself, belonged to someone else. Someone Julian was planning to expose during his luncheon talk. Agatha pulled over into a lay-by, her hand shaking. She pulled out the notebook. Beneath the notes about the land deed, there was a small, tucked-away photograph. It was old, grainy, and showed a young man in a collar, looking remarkably like a youthful Mr. Bloxby, standing next to a woman whose face had been violently scratched out with a pen. On the back, in Julian's flamboyant script, were 3 words. "The first marriage." Agatha gasped. "Oh. What have you done?" Chapter 4. Tea, Sympathy, and a Secret Spouse. Agatha Raisin spent the following morning in a state of agitated productivity. She had scrubbed her kitchen counters 3 times, eaten a bowl of bran flakes that tasted like cardboard, and stared at the scratched-out face in the photograph until her eyes ached. The idea of the mild-mannered Alf Bloxby as a bigamister at the very least, a man with a hidden past was as shocking to Carsely's social fabric as the discovery of a strip club in the parish hall. If Julian Flight had intended to reveal this at the luncheon, it wasn't just a bombshell, it was a social nuclear strike. "Right," Agatha said, pulling on a navy blue trench coat that screamed understated authority. Time for a pastoral visit. The vicarage was a gloomy, sprawling building that always seemed to smell of floor wax and unconfessed sins. When Agatha rang the bell, the door was opened not by the vicar, but by his wife, Margaret Bloxby. Margaret was a woman of infinite patience and beige cardigans, but today her usual serenity was replaced by a sharp, defensive edge. "Agatha," Margaret said, blocking the doorway. "Alf is resting. The doctor gave him a sedative. It's been a terrible shock." "I am sure it has, Margaret," Agatha said, performing a practiced sideways maneuver shed learned in London to bypass aggressive receptionists. She was inside the hallway before Margaret could protest. "But I found something of Julian's, something that belongs to Alf. It's quite urgent. We don't want anything of Julian Flight's in this house," Margaret snapped, her voice trembling. "That man was a vulture. He came here pretending to care about our history, but he was only looking for rot." Agatha felt a cold shiver. "He was only looking for rot. I need to see him, Margaret, now, or I can take this straight to Bill Wilkes. I am trying to be a friend here, though I know I am not always very good at it." Margaret's shoulders slumped. She gestured toward the small, chilly sitting room. 5 minutes, Agatha, no more." The vicar was sitting by a cold fireplace, a tartan rug over his knees. He looked 10 years older than he had 24 hours ago. When he saw Agatha, he didn't look surprised, he looked resigned. "You found the notebook," he said quietly. Agatha sat opposite him, skipping the pleasantries. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and laid it on the coffee table. "Who is she, Alf? And why did Julian have a photo of you two from 1978? The vicar sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. Her name was Sheila. "We were married in London long before I took my vows, long before I ever came to the Cotswolds. It was a brief, disastrous union. She left me within a year. In those days, for a man of the cloth, or a man aspiring to the cloth, a divorce was a stain. I moved, I started over. I never told Margaret. I never told the bishop. And the land deed?" Agatha pressed. "The North Acre?" "Sheila inherited it," Bloxby whispered. "It was her family's land. When she disappeared, I assumed Shed sold it or let it go to the Crown. But Julian found her. She's alive, Agatha, in a nursing home in Bournemouth. And because we were never legally divorced, papers were never finalised, land technically still belongs to her. Which means the village expansion project, the one the parish council has been banking on, it's all built on a legal lie." Agatha gasped. "Julian was going to announce that? He was going to ruin you and halt the development. Half the village has invested in that project. He was going to destroy everything," the vicar said, a spark of sudden, uncharacteristic anger in his eyes. "Not for justice, but for the thrill of the reveal. He sat in my study and laughed, Agatha. He laughed at my life." Before Agatha could ask the golden question, "Did you kill him?" the front door burst open. James Lacey marched into the sitting room, followed closely by a smug-looking Di Wilkes. James looked at Agatha with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Agatha, what are you doing here?" James asked. "Investigating, James. Since you're too busy being a footstool for Sybil Vane to notice the vicar is in trouble." Di Wilkes stepped forward, checking his watch. "Well, you can stop the amateur dramatics, Mrs. Raisin. We've got our man. We just picked up Barry Miller at the Red Lion." Agatha frowned. Barry Miller was the village's resident bad larder man who did odd jobs, drank too much cider, and had a well-documented history of shouting at anyone who looked at him sideways. "Barry?" Agatha scoffed. "He hasn't got the brains to plan a murder, Bill. He can barely plan a grocery list." "He had a motive," Wilkes said, puffing out his chest. "Flight had reported him for poaching last week. And more importantly, we found the murder weapon bronze paperweight wiped clean but stashed in the back of Barry's van, wrapped in a bloody rag. It's an open and shut case," James added, though he wouldn't meet Agatha's eyes. "The village can breathe a sigh of relief." The vicar looked relieved, his hands finally stopping their tremble. Margaret Bloxby let out a long, shuddering breath, but Agatha felt a leaden weight in her stomach. It was too neat. A man like Julian Flight, who was juggling blackmail, land fraud, and secret marriages, didn't get killed by a drunken poacher who was stupid enough to keep the weapon in his van. "Wiped clean?" Agatha asked, her PR brain clicking into gear. If Barry was drunk enough to kill a man over a poaching fine, he wouldn't be sober enough to wipe the fingerprints off a paperweight and wrap it in a rag. That's not a crime of passion, Bill. That's a stage-managed production. "Go home," Agatha Wilkes said, his patience exhausted. "The case is closed. Let the professionals handle the paperwork." Oh, as they left the vicarage, James tried to catch her arm. "Agatha, let it go." "Barry's a violent man. It fits." Agatha shook him off, her pride wounded and her instincts screaming. "It fits like a cheap suit, James. It looks fine until you move, and then the seams start to pop." She watched them drive away, her mind racing back to the shed. Sybil Vane had been there. Sybil had known about the notebook, and Sybil was clever. A stage-managed production, Agatha whispered to herself, her eyes narrowing as she looked back at the vicarage. And every production needs a director. She got into her car, not heading for Lilac Cottage, but toward the local archives. If the Northacre land deed was the key, she needed to know exactly who stood to lose the most if the truth came out. And she had a feeling it wasn't just the vicar. Chapter 5. Records and Rancour. The Mercester Records Office was a place where joy went to die under the weight of acid-free paper and the oppressive smell of lemon polish. Agatha Raisin, currently occupying a hard wooden chair that seemed designed by a medieval inquisitor, was finding it particularly loathsome. She had spent 3 hours squinting at microfilm and dusty ledgers, her temper fraying like the hem of a cheap skirt. The clerk, a man whose personality was as exciting as a bowl of cold porridge, had been singularly unhelpful until Agatha had lied and told him she was conducting research for a prestigious London broadsheet. "The Northacre Project," Agatha muttered, her finger tracing a line on a planning map, "developed by Cotswold Heritage Limited." A very cosy, local-sounding name. She flipped through the company registration documents. Her PR-honed instincts were tingling. Companies that chose names sounding like a tourism brochure were usually hiding something far more industrial, far more illicit. "Let's see," she whispered. "Directors, Julian Flightwell, he's out of the running. Mrs. Margaret Witherspoon, hardly a criminal mastermind. Just a woman with a passion for power and floral hats. And SV Management Services out of the British Virgin Islands." "SV Sybil Vane," Agatha hissed, a predatory smile spreading across her face. "You live little viper." She leaned back, her mind whirring. If Sybil was a hidden director of the company that stood to make millions from the development, she had every reason to want Julian Flight silenced. If Julian had discovered that the land didn't legally belong to the church because of the vicar's secret marriage, the entire project would be tied up in litigation for decades. The bombshell wouldn't just ruin the vicar, it would bankrupt the developers. Agatha felt a surge of triumph. She stood up, gathered her things, and marched toward the exit, nearly colliding with a tall, elegant figure in the doorway. It was Sybil Vane. She was wearing a perfectly tailored cream coat and carrying a leather portfolio. For a moment, the two women stared at each other, a clash of London steel versus Cotswold silk. "Back so soon, Mrs. Raisin?" Sybil asked, her voice cool and steady. "I should have thought a woman of your experience would find the archives a bit taxing on the eyes." "My eyes are perfectly fine," Sybil, Agatha snapped. "In fact, I've just been looking at some very interesting initials." "SV, it's a small world, isn't it? Especially when that world involves offshore accounts in the Caribbean." Sybil didn't flinch. Instead, she did something that caught Agatha off guard. "Oh." She reached into her handbag, pulled out a cigarette case, and then stopped, looking at a no-smoking sign with a look of genuine, unfiltered irritation. She bit her lip, a sharp, jagged movie menton for a split second. The mask of the serene, lithe newcomer slipped. She looked desperate. She looked like a woman who was one minor inconvenience away from a screaming fit. "You're trying to be clever, Agatha," Sybil said, her voice dropping an octave. "But you're playing a game you don't understand." Julian was a greedy man. He wanted a bigger slice of the pie than Head earned. People like Barry Miller are the natural consequence of greed. "Is that what you told James?" Agatha challenged. "Does he know his new lady friend as a silent partner in a land grab scheme?" Sybil stepped closer, the scent of expensive perfume suddenly feeling cloying. "James is a man who appreciates peace, Agatha. Something you have never been able to provide him. Don't ruin his illusions. It would be terribly inconvenient for you." Sybil turned and glided away, her composure restored. But Agatha remained frozen for a moment. She had noticed it. A tiny social misstep. When Sybil had bitten her lip in frustration, she had used a very specific, coarse idiom under her breath, something in a thick North London accent that was a world away from the refined, ethereal persona she'd been projecting. "A Londoner," Agatha whispered. "A Londoner pretending to be a county lady. I know that game. I invented that game." Agatha hurried to her car. She didn't believe for a second that Barry Miller had killed Julian. The paperweight in the van was too perfect, too stage-managed, as Shed told Wilkes. She decided to pay a visit to the Red Lion. If she was going to prove Barry was a scapegoat, she needed to talk to the one person who knew his movements. The barmaid. The Red Lion was relatively quiet, the mid-afternoon sun filtering through the leaded windows. Mary, the barmaid, was polishing glasses with a look of grim determination. "Awful about Barry," Agatha began, sliding onto a stool. "Hard to believe he'd have the energy to murder someone between pints." "He didn't," Mary said flatly. "Barry's a loudmouth and a nuisance, but he was right here at that luncheon time. He came in at 12:15, complaining that the parish hall was full of stuck-up gentry and he couldn't get a decent sandwich. He didn't leave until 3, and by then he was too far gone to drive a van, let alone wrap a murder weapon in a rag." 12:15? Agatha asked. "And the murder happened between 12 and 12:30. If he was here by 12:15, he'd have had to kill Julian, clean the weapon, hide it in his van, and drive to the pub in under 10 minutes. It's impossible." "Tell that to the police," Mary sighed. "They wanted an easy win, and Barry's the easiest target we've got." Agatha felt a familiar prick of irritation at the incompetence of the authorities. But more than that, she felt a thrill. She had a timeline, she had a motive, money and land, and she had a suspect who was hiding behind a fake accent and a linen dress. But there was one thing she was missing. If Sybil had killed Julian, how did she get the weapon into Barry's van? Agatha finished her tonic water and stood up. "Mary, who does the cleaning at the old granary where Julian was staying? That would be Doris Simpson." "Why?" Because Agatha said, adjusting her hat with a determined flick of her wrist. "I have a feeling Doris might have seen someone lithe poking around a certain white van yesterday afternoon." She marched out of the pub, her heart racing. She was closing in. But as she reached her car, she saw a note tucked under her windshield wiper. "Drop it, Agatha, or the next secret to come out will be yours. How's the London Pension Fund looking?" Agatha crumpled the paper, her face flushing with a mix of fear and fury. Someone was digging into her own past the messy, sometimes ethically grey career in PR. "Right," she growled, throwing the car into gear. "Now it's personal. Chapter 6, Committees and Contempt. If there was one thing Agatha Raisin loathed more than a cold cup of tea, it was an emergency meeting of the Carsely Ladies' Committee where she wasn't the one holding the gavel. The meeting had been convened at the home of Mrs. Margaret Witherspoon, a sprawling, ivy-clad manor that smelled perpetually of lavender and unearned superiority. The official agenda was community healing in the wake of tragedy, but Agatha knew the real purpose: social damage control. Agatha arrived 10 minutes late, partly because Shed spent too much time trying to decide if a pinstriped power suit was too London for a village crisis, and partly because she wanted to make an entrance. She was greeted by a wall of silence. Mrs. Witherspoon sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by the usual cadre of village matrons, and Agatha's heart sank the ever-present Sybil Vane. "Ah, Agatha," Mrs. Witherspoon said, her voice like a velvet glove stuffed with gravel. "Do find a seat. We were just discussing the delicate matter of the Spring Equinox Fund. Given the unpleasantness, we feel it best to distance ourselves from anything Julian Flight was associated with." "Distance yourselves?" Agatha sat down, her chair scraping loudly on the polished floor. "The man was murdered, Margaret. He wasn't caught with his hand in the biscuit tin. We should be helping the police find the real killer instead of worrying about whether the village preserves are tainted by association. The real killer is in custody." "Agatha," Sybil Vane interjected softly. She was wearing a soft cashmere cardigan that looked like it cost more than Agatha's car. "The police were very clear. Barry Miller is the culprit. Why must you persist in stirring the pot? It's quite exhausting for the rest of us." Agatha felt the blood rise to her cheeks. "It's exhausting for the truth too, Sybil. Especially when that truth involves land deeds and offshore accounts. Or perhaps we should talk about your sudden interest in our village archives." The room went deathly quiet. Mrs. Witherspoon narrowed her eyes, a predatory glint appearing behind her spectacles. "Agatha, dear, we all know you had a very colourful career in London. But here in Carsely we value decorum over sensationalism. Your penchant for investigating is becoming a social liability. James Lacey was only saying this morning how concerned he is that you're losing your grip on reality. The blow hit Agatha right in her pride. James had been talking about her. To them? James doesn't know the half of it, Agatha blustered, though she felt a treacherous sting in her eyes. And neither do you, Margaret. You're all so desperate to keep the North Acre development on track that You'd let an innocent man rot in a cell. That is quite enough, Mrs. Witherspoon stood up, her floral bosom heaving. This meeting is for members of the committee in good standing. Since you seem intent on slandering our residents and our guests, perhaps you would be more comfortable elsewhere. Agatha stood up, her legs trembling slightly. She looked around the room. Not a single person met her eye, not even Mrs. Bloxby, who looked down at her knitting as if the pattern for a baby's booty held the secrets of the universe. Fine, Agatha snapped, grabbing her handbag. Enjoy your tea and your lies. But don't come crying to me when the bailiffs arrive to seize the church land. She marched out, but she didn't leave the house immediately. Her PR instincts told her that Mrs. Witherspoon's outrage was a little too practiced. Instead of heading for the front door, Agatha slipped into the cloakroom, ostensibly to find her coat, but really to catch her breath. Through the heavy oak door of the dining room, she heard the low murmur of voices. She's getting too close, Margaret, a voice whispered. It was Sybil. The note didn't scare her off. Agatha is a nuisance, but she's predictable, Mrs. Witherspoon replied, her voice no longer velvet but cold steel. She'll go to James, and James will settle her down. He's the only leash she responds to. In the meantime, we need to ensure Flight's personal effects are properly disposed of. I won't have his research ruining 40 years of work. 40 years of work. Agatha frowned. Julian Flight had only been in the village for 3 weeks. Why would Mrs. Witherspoon be worried about 40 years of work unless Julian had found something much older than a land deed? Agatha peeked through the crack in the door. Mrs. Witherspoon was holding a small silver objector locket, old and tarnished. Oh. She was looking at it with an expression that wasn't anger, but a deep, haunting regret. Then Sybil reached out and took the locket. I'll handle it. Just keep the vicar quiet. If he cracks, the whole thing goes under. Agatha didn't wait to hear more. She slipped out of the house and practically ran to her car. Her mind was a whirlwind. Mrs. Witherspoon and Sybil Vane weren't just business partners, they were collaborators in a cover-up that spanned decades. And the locket, Agatha had seen one just like it in the photograph Julian had kept. The photo of the vicar and his first wife, Sheila. Agatha drove straight to James Cottage. She didn't care if she looked desperate or out of her grip. She needed an ally, and despite his foolishness, James was the only person she trusted. She pounded on his door. When he opened it, he looked weary. Agatha, if this is about Barry Miller, it's not just about Barry, James. It's about Margaret Witherspoon. I think she knew Julian Flight long before he came to Carsely. And I think Sybil Vane isn't just a stranger, she's the one pulling Margaret's strings. James sighed, leaning against the doorframe. Agatha, Sybil is a friend of Margaret's niece. She's here to help with the development. You're seeing ghosts because you're jealous. Jealous? I'm terrified, James. They are talking about handling Julian's research, and Margaret has a locket that belongs to the vicar's secret wife. James paused, his expression shifting from annoyance to a faint, lingering doubt. A locket! What did it look like? Silver, oval, with a tiny blue stone in the center, Agatha described, remembering the detail from the grainy photo. James went very still. My mother had a locket like that. She said it was a common design in the 70s. But Agatha... Margaret Witherspoon didn't live here in the 70s. She moved here in the 90s from London. Exactly, Agatha cried. And where did the vicar come from? London. They all have roots in the same soil, James, and that soil is covered in Julian Flight's blood. Before James could respond, his phone chimed. He looked at the screen and his face paled. What is it? Agatha asked. It's from the police, James whispered. There's been another incident. Doris Simpson, the woman who cleaned for Julianne, has been found at the bottom of her cellar stairs. They are saying it was an accidental fall. Agatha felt the world tilt. Doris, the woman who might have seen someone at Barry's van. Not an accident, James, Agatha said, her voice trembling but certain. A second incident. Just like I said. The killer isn't Barry Miller, and they aren't finished yet. Chapter 7. Shadows and silk. The death of Doris Simpson cast a shroud over Carsely that even the cheerful spring daffodils couldn't pierce. To the police, it was a tragic mishap, an elderly woman losing her footing on steep stone stairs. To Agatha Raisin, it was a tactical strike. She was going to talk to me, Agatha paced her kitchen, a half-eaten microwave shepherd's pie cooling on the counter. The murderer knew I was sniffing around Doris. It's my fault. For a rare moment, Agatha's ironclad vanity cracked. She felt small, lonely, and remarkably old. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window. The sunset crimson lipstick now looked like a desperate mask. She was a London shark in a village pond, but she had forgotten that ponds could contain very deep, very cold pockets of mud. The phone rang, jarring her out of her self-pity. "Agatha? It's Bill Wilkes." My voice sounded uncharacteristically subdued. "I'm at the station. We had a bit of a situation. Barry Miller's solicitor brought in a witness. A lorry driver who caught Barry on his dashcam at the red line at 12:20. It's a rock-solid alibi. I told you," Agatha yelled, her spirits rebounding with the speed of a coiled spring. "I told you the paperweight was planted. Are you releasing him? We have to. But Agatha, listen to me. If Barry didn't do it, someone went to a lot of trouble to make us think he did. Someone clever. Don't go playing the hero. Stay inside and lock your doors." "I am not a child, Bill." Agatha slammed the phone down. "Lock the doors?" Agatha Raisin did not lock herself away while a lithe murderer was swan-necking her way around the village. If the police were finally admitting they were wrong, Agatha needed to be 3 steps ahead. She grabbed her handbag, but as she reached for her car keys, she noticed something under the door. A small, white envelope. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single printed line: "The North Acre is a graveyard. Agatha." "Ask the vicar about the well," Agatha whispered. The pagan ritual site Julian was talking about. She headed out, but not to the well. She headed to the vicarage. She needed to know what was in that locket, and she needed to know why Margaret Witherspoon, the most upright woman in the Cotswolds, was holding onto a piece of the vicar's shameful past. As she pulled up to the vicarage, she saw a silver Mercedes parked in the drive. It wasn't the vicar's car. It was Sybil Vane's. Agatha didn't ring the bell. Oh. She crept around the side of the house, her heels sinking into the flower beds of sacrifice she made with a grimace. She reached the window of the vicar's study. The curtains were partially drawn, but she could see inside. Sybil was there, but she wasn't alone. She was standing over Mr. Bloxby, who was slumped in his chair. Margaret Bloxby was standing by the fireplace, her face a mask of cold fury. "It's over, Alf," Sybil said, her voice sharp and devoid of its usual melodic lilt. "The police have released Barry. Agatha Raisin is digging into the 1978 records. We need the deed, and we need it now." "I don't have it," the vicar cried. "Julian took it. He said he was going to present it at the luncheon as proof of the unholy foundation of the village expansion." "Then where is it?" Margaret Bloxby demanded. Agatha froze. The vicar's wifeth woman of beige cardigan sounded more dangerous than Sybil. If Julian had it, it wasn't in his briefcase. "I searched that shed myself." "You searched it?" Sybil turned on Margaret. "You told me you were at the committee meeting." "I took a bathroom break," Margaret snapped. "While you were busy batting your eyelashes at James Lacey to keep him distracted, I was trying to save our future. That land is worth £5 million, Sybil. I am not letting a dead historian and a nosy PR woman take that away from me." Agatha gasped, her breath fogging the glass. Margaret Bloxby wasn't the victim of a secret marriage, she was the architect of a financial empire. Suddenly, a heavy hand dropped onto Agatha's shoulder. She let out a muffled shriek and spun around, her handbag raised like a mace. "Easy, Agatha." "It's only me," James Lacey whispered, looking startled. "James, you nearly gave me a heart attack." "I followed you," James said, his face grim in the moonlight. "I saw Sybil's car. I started thinking about what you said about the locket. Agatha, I checked my mother's old photos. Margaret Witherspoon isn't the woman in the locket. But look at this." He handed her a small, grainy photograph. It was a group shot from a London parish social in 1977. There was a young Alf Bloxby, and standing next to him with a silver locket around her neck was a young woman with a sharp, familiar face. Agatha squinted. "That's not Sheila, the first wife." "That's Margaret?" "Margaret wasn't the first wife," James whispered. "She was the reason for the divorce. She was the one who helped Alf hide the truth so he could keep his position. They've been living a lie for 40 years, Agatha. And Julian Flight found out that the land belonged to the woman they betrayed." "And Sybil?" Agatha asked. "Look at the girl in the background, Agatha, the one holding Margaret's hand." Agatha looked. A small, thin girl with a long neck and a cold, steady gaze. Sybil Eisenter Guest, Agatha realized, her blood running cold. "She's Margaret's daughter." Not Alfshire's two old butt Margarets from a previous inconvenience. They aren't business partners. They are a family of vipers. Inside the room, the voices rose. Agatha Raisin has the notebook, the vicar wailed. I saw her at the shed. Sybil's head snapped toward the window. Agatha and James dove into the bushes just as the curtain was yanked back. She's here, Sybil's voice hissed through the glass. I can smell that cheap London perfume. Run, James whispered. Agatha didn't need telling twice. She scrambled out of the rose bushes, ignoring the thorns tearing at her stockings. They reached her BMW and scrambled in, Agatha flooring the accelerator before the door was even fully shut. Where are we going? James shouted as they fishtailed onto the main road. The well! Agatha cried. The moat said to ask about the well. If the deed wasn't in the shed, and the vicar doesn't have it, Julian must have hidden it where he thought nobody would look. He was a historian, James. He'd hide the truth in the middle of a legend. But as she checked her rearview mirror, she saw the twin beams of the silver Mercedes swinging out of the vicarage drive. They were being followed, and Sybil Vane didn't look like she was in the mood for a polite social chat. Oh. Chapter 8, The Well of Truth. The Cotswold night was no longer picturesque, it was a sprawling, ink-black trap. Agatha gripped the steering wheel of her BMW so hard her knuckles ached. Behind them, the silver Mercedes loomed like a predatory shark, its high beams reflecting off Agatha's rearview mirror and searing into her retinas. They are going to ram us, Agatha shrieked, her voice hitting a register that usually only gathered dogs could hear. James, do something. Throw something at them. My handbag used the heavy Chanel knockoff. Just drive, Agatha, James yelled, bracing himself against the dashboard. Turn left at the spinney! If we can get to the well via the footpath, the Mercedes won't be able to follow. It's too wide for the lane. Agatha swung the wheel with a desperate grunt. The BMW lurched, its tires screaming as it veered onto a narrow, rutted track hemmed in by ancient stone walls. The Mercedes slowed, the screech of metal on stone echoing through the night as Sybil realized the physical limitations of her luxury vehicle. Agatha didn't stop until the track became a mere bridleway. She killed the engine and the lights. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the frantic thumping of her own heart. We have to go on foot, James whispered. The old well is just past those oaks. They scrambled out of the car. The air was biting, and the ground was a treacherous mix of mud and tangled roots. Agatha, cursing the day she decided that pointed toes were essential for detective chic, stumbled along behind James. The village well was a crumbling stone structure, capped with a rusted iron grate and surrounded by a circle of leaning monoliths that looked like rotting teeth. Lonely, eerie place steeped in local superstitions that Agatha usually dismissed as rural nonsense. Julian's note, Agatha panted, leaning against a cold stone. He said, The North Acre is a graveyard. Ask about the well. James, look at the base. James pulled a small torch from his pocket. The beam swept over the lichen-covered stones. There, he pointed. One of the stones at the foundation looked cleaner than the others, the mortar around it fresher at least, disturbed. Agatha knelt, ignoring the ruin of her navy blue trousers. She clawed at the stone, her manicured nails snapping. Together, they heaved the block outward. It slid with a grinding protest, revealing a hollow cavity. Inside was a vacuum-sealed plastic pouch. The deed? James asked. Agatha pulled it out. It wasn't just a deed. It was a thick bundle of papers and a microcassette recorder. She flicked the play button. Julian Flight's voice, oily and triumphant, filled the clearing. Entry 24. I've found it. The North Acre isn't just disputed land. In 1978, the missing decade of Alf Bloxby ended with the death of his first wife, Sheila. The village legend says she ran away, but the soil samples from the well's drainage pipe say otherwise. High calcium deposits consisted with the recording cut off with a sharp click. Not just a secret marriage, Agatha whispered, her face ashen. A secret grave. They didn't just hide the divorce, James. They hid a body. How very observant of you, Agatha. The voice came from the shadows behind the oaks. Sybil Vane stepped into the moonlight. She wasn't alone. Margaret Bloxby stood beside her, holding a heavy, old-fashioned flashlight like a club. But it was what Sybil held that made Agatha's blood turn to ice. It was a small, compact pistol modern, sleek and utterly terrifying. The live look really is a facade, isn't it? Agatha said, her bravado returning in a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline. You're just a common London thug in a cashmere wrapper. London taught me how to survive, Sybil said, her North London accent now fully present, hard and jagged. My mother taught me how to thrive. Alf was a weak man who made a mistake. My mother was the one who cleaned it up. She ensured his career, his reputation, and our future. By killing Sheila? James asked, stepping in front of Agatha. Sheila was a drunk and a liability, Margaret Bloxby said, her voice devoid of its usual parish milk and honey tone. She was going to ruin Alf's chances at the ministry. She fell. I just ensured she stayed down, and we buried her where the pagan spirits would take the blame for any strange noises. And Julian found out, Agatha said. So you killed him too. And Doris Simpson because she saw Sybil planting the paperweight in Barry's van. Julian was a blackmailer. Sybil spat. He didn't want justice. He wanted £1 million to keep his mouth shut about the North Acre and the well. We don't have £1 million, Snot, until the development starts. Which it won't, Agatha snapped. Because you're going to join Sheila, Sybil said, raising the gun. A tragic accident. A double disappearance. The meddling Agatha Raisin and her neighbour, lost in the Cotswold mists. The village will gossip for a month, and then forget you ever existed. Agatha looked at James. He looked at her. In that moment, Agatha didn't feel like a failed PR executive or a lonely retiree. She felt like a woman who had been insulted by a better-dressed criminal. Forget me? Agatha barked. I'm Agatha Raisin, you little hussy. I've survived the London press corps and 3 husbands. You think I'm going to let a woman in a pashmina shoot me? In a move that was less martial arts and more desperate lunging, Agatha swung her heavy handbag with everything she had. Chapter 9. The Raisin Gambit, the heavy Chanel knockoff, whistled through the air like a medieval morning star. It connected with Sybil Vane's forearm just as the gun barked, a deafening crack that sent a bullet whistling into the ancient oak behind them. Sybil let out a snarl of pain, the pistol skittering across the muddy ground toward the mouth of the well. Run, James. The gun, Agatha shrieked. But Margaret Bloxby, surprisingly agile for a woman who spent her Sundays arranging altar lilies, lunged forward. She didn't go for the gun, she went for the plastic pouch in Agatha's hand. It's mine, the vicar's wife hissed, her face contorted into a mask of feral greed. 40 years of silence! You won't take it. Agatha found herself locked in an undignified wrestling match with the pillar of the community. They tumbled onto the damp grass, a flurry of wool coats and desperate gasps. Agatha felt a sharp pain as Margaret's sturdy, sensible shoe found her shin. You... Mazzatable. Old bat, Agatha grunted, punctuating each word with a shove. Meanwhile... James had tackled Sybil. The two of them were a blur of movement near the monoliths. Sybil was fighting like a cornered cat, using her lithe limbs to claw and kick. James, usually a gentleman to a fault, looked genuinely bewildered to be in a life-or-death struggle with a woman who looked like a fashion model. Agatha! Look out! James yelled. Sybil had broken free. She didn't head for the gun. Oh. She headed for the Mercedes, which Shed managed to reverse and park at the end of the bridleway. Mother, come on! Sybil screamed. Leave them! Without the deed, they have nothing but a recording. Margaret Bloxby gave Agatha one final vicious shove and scrambled toward the car. Agatha lay on the ground, gasping for air, her chest heaving against the constraints of her corset. She watched the silver taillights of the Mercedes vanish into the night. Thea getting away, James panted, rushing to Agatha's side and helping her up. Agatha, are you all right? You're bleeding. Agatha wiped a smear of mud and blood from her cheek. She looked down at her hands. They were empty. The pouch, she whispered. She got the pouch, James. The deed, the maps, everything. James slumped against the stone well. Then it's over. It's our word against theirs. Wilkes will never believe us without physical evidence, and they'll have burned those papers before they even reach the main road. Agatha stood up, slowly. She brushed off her coat with a series of sharp, rhythmic slaps. Her eyes, usually darting with social anxiety, were suddenly cold and focused. No, Agatha said, her voice surprisingly steady. It isn't over. They think they've won because they have the paper, but they've forgotten one thing. I was the head of Raisin PR. I don't need evidence to destroy someone. I just need an audience. Agatha, what are you talking about? The parish council meeting, Agatha said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her sunset crimson lips. It starts in 20 minutes. The entire village will be there to vote on the final approval for the North Acre development. Margaret and Sybil think they are going there to collect their fortune. You can't just walk in and accuse them, James protested. They'll laugh you out of the hall. Oh, I'm not just going to accuse them, James. I'm going to provoke them. A cornered animal is dangerous, but a triumphant one is arrogant. And arrogance is a much easier target. Agatha marched back toward her BMW, her broken heel causing her to limp, but she carried herself like a queen going to a guillotine specifically. Someone else's. "James," she called over her shoulder, "did you get the tape recorder?" James reached into his pocket and pulled out the small micro-cassette player. "I grabbed it when you were wrestling Margaret, but it's just Julian's voice. It's not a confession from them." "It's enough for a bombshell," Agatha said, her eyes flashing. "Now, give me your phone. I need to make a call to a certain friend in London who owes me a very large favour involving a portable PA system." 20 minutes later, the Carsely parish hall was packed to the rafters. The air was thick with the smell of damp coats and anticipation. At the front of the room, the parish council sat in a semicircle of self-importance. In the front row, looking remarkably composed given they had just been in a muddy brawl, sat Margaret Bloxby and Sybil Vane. The vicar sat between them, his face the colour of parchment, his eyes fixed on the floor. Mrs. Margaret Witherspoon stood at the lectern. "And so," she announced, her voice booming with satisfaction, "we come to the final vote. The North Acre project represents a new era for Carsely. If there are no further objections, I have an objection." The double doors at the back of the hall swung open. Agatha Raisin stood there. Oh! She was a sight to behold. Her hair was a bird's nest of twigs and dried mud. Her navy suit was torn and she was wearing only one shoe. But she held her chin high, her gaze locked onto Margaret Bloxby. A ripple of laughter and whispers broke out. "Look at her. She's finally lost it. Drunk, I expect." Agatha ignored them. She walked down the centre aisle, her single heel clicking like a metronome. "I object," Agatha repeated, reaching the front of the room. "Because you can't build a housing estate on a graveyard, and you certainly can't build it on a foundation of murder." "Agatha, sit down, Mrs." Witherspoon sighed. "This is a serious meeting, not one of your episodes." "Oh, it's serious, Margaret," Agatha said, turning to face the crowd. "It's so serious that the vicar's wife just tried to kill me at the old well. She wanted the papers Julian Flight hidden there. Papers that prove Sheila Bloxby didn't run away 40 years ago. She was murdered. And she's buried right where the new community centre is supposed to go." The hall went silent. Every eye turned to Margaret Bloxby. Margaret didn't flinch. She gave a small, pitying laugh. "Agatha, dear, you've always had a vivid imagination. But to accuse me of such a thing without a shred of proof? It's pathetic, really." "Is it?" Agatha asked. She looked at the vicar. "Alf, is it pathetic? Or is it the truth you've been carrying like a stone in your pocket?" The vicar looked up, his lips trembling. Sybil Vane leaned in, her hand gripping his arm with bruising force. "Don't listen to her, Alf," Sybil hissed. Agatha took a step closer to the table. "You have the papers, don't you, Margaret? You took them from me. You probably think you've won. But you forgot one thing about Julian Flight. Masterclass in crisis management, James. Though I expect he'll be banned from the Ladies' Committee for life now. Margaret Witherspoon looks like she's about to have a stroke." "I think Yow'll find the village owes you an apology," James said. He reached out and touched her arm. "And perhaps I owe you a dinner. Somewhere far away from parish halls and elderflower cordial." Agatha felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with her corset. "Dinner? Well, I suppose I could fit it in. If you can find a restaurant that doesn't mind a guest in one shoe and a suit that smells of compost." "I think I can manage that," James smiled. As the villagers began to disperse, talking in hushed, feverish tones about the Bloxby scandal, Agatha stood in the centre of the hall. She was bruised, her hair was a disaster, and her social standing was, as usual, precarious. But as she looked at the empty space where the lithe Sybil Vane had sat, Agatha felt a sense of immense solitary triumph. Carsely would never be the same. The North Acre would remain a field, the vicar would likely retire in disgrace, and the gossip would sustain the village for a decade. "Right," Agatha said to herself, straightening her torn jacket. "Now, where on earth did I leave my other shoe?" Chapter 11. The dust settles on Carsely the weeks following the parish hall purge, as the London tabloids had briefly and gleefully dubbed it, was some of the quietest and yet most exhausting of Agatha Raisin's life. Carsely had become a village of drawn curtains and hushed voices. The vicar had resigned, vanishing into a quiet retreat in the north, leaving the parish in the hands of a temporary curate who looked far too young to handle a congregation that had recently harboured a murderer. The North Acre project was dead, buried under the weight of legal injunctions, and the grim reality of the archaeological excavation taking place at the old well. Agatha sat in her garden, a glass of Chardonnay in one hand, and a catalogue for luxury footwear in the other. She was wearing a new pair of navy silk trousers and a crisp white blouse, having burned the soot shed worn to the well in a fit of symbolic cleansing. A graveyard, Agatha muttered, looking toward the hills. All that fuss over a housing estate, and it was a graveyard all along. People are remarkably sordid when money is involved. Her cat, Hodge, rubbed against her ankles, purring with a lack of concern for village politics that Agatha found both enviable and irritating. She heard the familiar crunch of gravel. James Lacey appeared at the gate, looking as he always did, infuriatingly composed. He was carrying a small box and a bottle of wine. "Afternoon, Agatha," he said, letting himself in. "I thought you might be brooding." "I don't brood, James. I reflect." "There's a difference," Agatha snapped, though she felt the familiar, treacherous leap of her heart. "What's in the box? If it's another recording of a murder, you can take it right back to the station." James smiled, sitting in the chair opposite her. "It's a lemon drizzle cake from the new bakery in Mercester. I thought we could celebrate the fact that for 3 days, no one has been arrested in our immediate vicinity." He set the box down and began to open the wine. "The news from the police is that Margaret Bloxby is refusing to speak, but Sybil has started a full confession in exchange for a lighter sentence. She's blaming her mother for everything, of course. Says she was coerced by maternal duty." "Coerced?" "She was the one holding the gun, James." Agatha snorted. The woman was as cold as a frozen pea, and twice as green with envy. She didn't want maternal duty, she wanted a penthouse in Mayfair and a life away from the stifling countryside. "And now she has a cell in a very different sort of institution," James agreed. They sat in silence for a moment, the sun dipping behind the thatch of Lilac Cottage. It was a perfect Cotswold evening, the kind that usually filled Agatha with a sense of peace. But today there was a lingering prickle of loneliness. The dinner James had promised had been a quiet affair, polite, pleasant, and entirely devoid of the romantic epiphany Agatha had spent 40 minutes applying her makeup for. "You're thinking about the locket again, aren't you?" James asked. "I'm thinking about Sheila," Agatha admitted, her voice softening. 40 years at the bottom of a well while her husband lived a lie, and the woman who killed her ran the ladies' committee. It makes one realize how little we actually know about the people we drink tea with. James looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You knew, Agatha. You saw the cracks when everyone else was looking at the wallpaper. You have a knack for the truth, even if you do tend to kick the door down to find it." "Well, someone has to," Agatha said, her pride resurfacing. The police were ready to throw the key away on Barry Miller. "If I hadn't kicked the door down, Sybil and Margaret would be breaking ground on the North Acre right now." "True." James stood up, dusting crumbs from his trousers. "Well, I should get back. I have a manuscript to finish. Are you coming to the coffee morning on Tuesday?" "Mrs. Witherspoon is trying to rally the troops." Agatha felt a surge of her old defiance. "Margaret Witherspoon can rally her own troops. I have a hair appointment in London. I've decided that if I'm going to be the village pariah for a while, I might as well have a decent set of highlights." James laughed, a warm sound that lingered in the air after Head left. Agatha watched him walk down the lane. She was, as she often was, alone. Her victory had been absolute, her deduction brilliant, and her social standing was complicated. Half the village hailed her as a hero, the other half looked at her as if she were a carrier of the plague. She took a sip of her wine. The lithe Sybil vein was gone. The vicar's secret was out. And Carsely was, for the moment, safe from the bombshells of historians. "Right," Agatha said to Hodge, who was now snoozing in a patch of sunlight. "No more mysteries. I shall focus on the garden. I shall learn to grow prize-winning roses. I shall become a woman of quiet, dignified leisure." The phone inside the cottage rang. Agatha froze. She shouldn't answer it. It was probably a cold caller or Mrs. Witherspoon wanting a donation for the Vicarage Rehabilitation Fund. She went inside and picked up the receiver. Agatha Raisin speaking. "Agatha? It's Bill Wilkes. Look, I'm sorry to bother you, but something's come up in Ancombe. A local farmer found a tractor submerged in the river, and there's a body in the cab. But the tractor was reported stolen 6 months ago, and the body is wearing a tuxedo." Agatha felt the adrenaline kick in. Sharp and sweet. The roses could wait. The quiet, dignified leisure was for people who didn't have a tuxedo case to solve. "A tuxedo, Bill?" Agatha said, her eyes sparkling as she reached for her notepad and her sunset crimson lipstick. "Don't touch a thing.